Now we're here on the top of Daf Gimel Amid Beis. Ella, however, we have a problem here because if you're telling me that there's a unique similarity between Miluim and Yoma Kippurim, that in both cases the par and the aisle have to be purchased from private property of the Kohen Gadol, or in the case of Aaron, as Kohen Gadol. That makes sense according to Rabbi Yoshua. But according to the dissenting view, that whenever it says kach lecha or aseh lecha, it means lecha mishel tzibur, that the monies come from communal funds, from the Trumas HaLishka. It's Ma'ikal Ameimer. According to this opinion, disagreeing with Rav Yoshia, the par in the Isle of Miluim came from the tzibur. And therefore, you cannot give the answer that we had earlier in the name of Rabbi Avo, that we should prefer comparing Yom Kippurim to Miluim, because in both cases it comes from the private property, the mamon of the Kohen Gadol. That's not true, because now we're holding, according to Mandiyoma, the Aseh Lecha. Lecha is not a reference to an individual, but rather to the entire tzibur. Now, where is this machlokas? We go back to the original source, and this is the brisa that's going to record two opinions about lecha. Disanya, kach lecha. In the parsha of Ketores, it says in Vayikra Lamed, in Shmotz Lamed, it says Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, kach lecha samim nataf. Or in the case of Chatzotzos, as we mentioned earlier, in Parshas Baloscha, say lecha shtei Chatzotzos. We'll have a similar structure in the case of Shemen Lima'or for the Hadlokas Haneros, where it says in Vayikra Chavdal, Tzavetz Bnei Yisrael v'yikhu lecha Shemen Zayizah. So the Brisa records the first opinion. Kach lecha means mishalcha. Aseh lecha means mishalcha. V'yikhu elecha mishel tzibur. Only when it says elecha, as we saw in the parsha of Hadlokas Haner Shemen Lamar, the word elecha means mishel tzibur. Divrei Rabbi Yoshia. So Rabbi Yoshia is the opinion that in both the parsha of Toretz and the parsha of Chatzotzos, where it says the word lecha, it means mishalcha. And therefore, we have a parallel case in Yom Kippur, and we're going to say that lecha, and in Milu, where it says lecha, it means mishalcha. Rabbi Yonasan Omer, he disagrees. Bein kach lecha, bein v'yikhu lecha, mishal tzibur. There's no difference between lecha and elecha. In both cases, we interpret to mean monies that come from the communal fund. It sounds a little bit odd to say that the word lecha, which is in the singular, is referring to the entire community. And the answer is kaviyachol. Kaviyachol means that HaKadosh Baruch Hu sometimes considers it as if it were, in this case, lecha. Mishalchani rotze yoser mishalahem. I want your karbanos, and if you could bring the karbanos from your money, matov, that's wonderful. But when it says kach lecha, it means take the carbon from the communal funds, and I'll consider it as if it came from you. Again, if you could possibly dig into your pocket and pay for it, that's fine. That's an ideal situation, perhaps. But the Torah is saying, I considered it as lecha, even though it came from the tzibur. And the Brisa continues, Abba Chanan Omer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer, Kosev Echad Omer. With regard to the Aron, we have a pasuk in Dvarim Perek Yud, V'asisa lecha Aron eitz, and it has the word lecha, which sounds like Moshe Rabbeinu has to dig into his own pocket to purchase the wood for the Aron, for the ark. Kosev Echad Omer V'asu Aron Atzei V'asu is in the plural, implying that the money is coming from communal funds. Kate said, how do we reconcile this? The first pasuk is in Sefer Dvarim, in Parshas Baloscha, and the second pasuk is in Parshas Truma, Sefer Shmos. So the reason that there's no contradiction between the two, says Rabbi Yonasan, is because Kan Bisman Yisrael Otzim Ritzon Shel Makom, but Kan Bisman She'en Yisrael Otzim Ritzon Shel Makom. During a period of time when the Jewish people are on the highest level, they're fulfilling the will of God meticulously, implementing the Torah mitzvahs, then that's where the pasuk in Dvarim, when it says V'asisa Lecha, I may have mistakenly said Ba'aloscha. Scratch it out. We're talking about Parshas Eker. And there it says Lecha, and it's considered as if it's Lecha, as if it comes from you. But when it says V'asu Aaron, and that's considered that what? That when it says V'asu Aaron, right? So that's the pasuk in Parshas Truma. That's talking about Bisman Yisrael Otzim Ritzon. It's considered as if Klal Yisrael as a whole did the avodah. In any event, it comes clear from this brayso that according to Rav Ochia, we know that Kach Lecha means Mishelcha. According to Rav Yonasan, Kach Lecha means Mishel Tzibur. According to Rav Yonasan, the Karbonos Miluim therefore would be Mishel Tzibur when it says Lecha. So we cannot accept the original answer that we were dealing with on Amud Aleph of Rabbi Avo, that we should learn Yom Kippur from Miluim, because in both cases the Karbonos are coming from the private funds of the Kohen Gadol. And we're back to the original question that we had. How do we know that the word Lechaper in Miluim is coming to teach us the preach of the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur? Maybe it's the preach of the Kohen Gadol before Shavuos or before Rosh Hashanah. And the answer is Ad Kan Lo Pligi, the machlokas between Rabbi Yochi and Rabbi Yonasan, Ela B'Kichos the Alma, Basios the Alma. As a general rule, when it says Kach Lecha or Asei Lecha, we have this machlokas here, whether it means Mishalcha or Mishal Tzibu. And that's Kichos the Alma. Or, for example, we had in Parshas Ketores, it says Vayomer Hashem el Moshe Kach Lecha Samim. That's another example of Asios the Alma. Or, for example, in the case of Chatzotzros, Asei Lecha Shtei Chatzotzros Kesef, that's another example of Asios the Alma. In other words, that's a general case of Asei Lecha, which is the subject of a machlok between Rav Yoshi and Rav Yonasan. Aval Hanach, but with regard to the Kach Lecha in Parshas Miluim, or Asei Asher Lo in the Karbonos of Yom Kippur, which the Gemara is going to quote immediately, Perushe Kamefarish de Mishalchahu. No one would question that the Torah is demanding that the Kohen Gadol pay this from his individual private funds. Even Rabbi Yonasan would agree. And why is that so? So we'll go through the psukim and we'll see that there is a clear-cut indication that here, when it says lecha, it means mishelcha. The Kohen Gadol has to dig into his pocket. Miluim, in the case of Miluim in Vayikra Perek Tes, Michti Ksiv, it says Ve'el Bnei Yisrael Tedaber Lemor Kechu Seir Izim Lechatos. So the word kechu in the plural is deliberately used in order to indicate clearly that the Seir Izim for the Chatos, in the case of Miluim, comes from the Tzibur. But in the pasuk that comes right before it, it says Vayomer El Aaron Kach Lecha Egel Ben Bakar Chatos Lamali. Why the change in language? It starts with Kach Lecha in Lashon Yachid and immediately goes into Lashon Rabim of Kechu. And that conscious itself is proof positive, Shmamina, that Kach Lecha Mishalchahu. And even Rabbi Yonasan would agree that in the case of Miluim, Aaron has to dig into his pocket and buy the Egel Ben Bakar Lechatos. And on Yom Kippur, we have a similar proof. And even Rabbi Yonasan would admit. Michti Ksiv, the pasuk says in Achrimos Bezos Yavo Aaron El HaKodesh Bepar Ben Bakar Lechatos, the Ayala Olam, Ume'es Adas B'nei Yisrael Yikach Shnei Seirei Izim Lechatos V'Alech Liola. So it says explicitly Me'es Adas B'nei Yisrael Yikach. With regard to the Shnei Seirim of Chatos, it says explicitly Me'es Adas B'nei Yisrael, which means from the communal funds. However, when it says with regard to the par and the aisle of Aaron, there it says, Bizos Yavo Aaron ala Kodesh, etc., etc. And it says, Vehikriv Aaron es parachatos asher lo. Lovely, why this distinction? You just finished telling me that Shnei Seirim is Me'ez Hadas B'nai Yisrael. Now you're saying that the parachatos of Aaron is asher lo. What is the asher lo coming to teach me? If not, Shmamina, the Haimi Shalom, that the lo of this pasuk is indicating that this carbon, namely the par ben bak and the ayaliola of Yom Kippurim, has to come mishalo. So since in both miluim and in the parchatos of Yom Kippurim, there's going to be an absolute unanimous agreement that in both of these cases it has to come mishalo. Therefore, everybody would agree and accept the original answer of Rabbi Avo that there's a absolute comparison between Yom Kippur Miluim because these karbanos are Mishalom. Now the Gemara quotes a different answer to the question as to why we prefer interpreting Milachaper, the word Lachaper, as referring in Miluim, as referring to Yom Kippurim, and not Rosh Hashanah or Atzeres. Achi Omar, he says that this ribui, this extra word Lachaper in Parshas Miluim, certainly should indicate Yom Kippurim rather than Rosh Hashanah and Atzeres. Why? Because done in Par Lachatos, the Ayali Ola, the Par Lachatos, the Ayal Li Ola. What happens is that what's unique about both Miluim and Yom Kippurim is that the Par is a Chatos. Again, there's no big chiddush that the Ayal is an Ola. I mean, that's classic. But the par here is not part of the karban ola of the aisle. The aisle and the par are two distinct entities, whereas the aisle is the ola, the par is lechatas. That's true in both miluim and in Yoma on Yoma Kippurim. And we're talking now about the par and ola of the carbon yachid of the Kohen Gadol, where it says, "Bezos yavo Aaron al hakodesh bepar ben bakar lechatas the ayal leola," and in Miluim, in Vayikra Perek Tes, it says, "Vayomer al Aaron kacha egel ben bakar lechatas the ayal leola." However, by way of contrast, lafuki Rosh Hashanah v'Atzeres, in those cases. In contrast, the travayu, both the par and the ayal, olos ninhu. The par is not a chatos, but rather an ola. I'm sorry, the par is not an ola, I meant to say, but rather a chatos. Now, the Gemara back on Daf Beis had a question with regard to the word lechaper and miluim. Maybe it's coming to tell you that even in a carbon yachid, it's called v'chaper, and Reuven brings his carbon, and the Kohen has to be porage for 7 days before he does the avodah of that private carbon of Reuven. Or the Gemara asked another question: why not assume that maybe the Kohen requires preacher for 7 days before any of the three regalim? And we also asked about Rosh Hashanah and Atzeres. The Gemara now suggests a whole new answer. Ravina Omar, Ravina says that what's common and strikingly similar between Yom Kippur and Miluim is we're talking about the Kohen Gadol. Danim avoda b'Kohen Gadol, me avoda b'Kohen Gadol. In Miluim, we're talking about Aaron as a Kohen Gadol doing all the avoda of those 7 days, and he was poresh mi beso. And in Yom Kippurim, the Kohen Gadol is going to do the avodah on Yom Kippurim. Lafuki kula kushison. As opposed to all the questions that you raised above on Daf Beis and at the beginning of Daf Gimel, these are all korbanos yachid. And should we talk about krisha for a carbon yachid, meaning the word yachid here is a little bit misleading. What I mean by yachid here means that although there may be a kapara element, but it's not brought about by the Kohen Gadol. Neither on an individual Karban Yachid Mamanich, nor on the Shalosh Regalim or Atzeres or Rosh Hashanah. In none of those cases is the avoda specifically on the shoulders of the obligatory on the shoulders of the Kohen Gadol. Any Kohen can come along. Lav avoda b'Kohen Gadol. Ikadamri. I'll give you another answer. Amar Avina, done in avoda tchila, me avoda tchila afuki hani the lav tchila. So he says, Ravina, that there's a striking similarity between Yom Kippurim and Miluim, because both in these two cases, the avodah can be classified as tchila, as opposed to all the other Korbanos Yachid and Shalosh Regalim and Rosh Hashanah and Atzeres. That's not called tchila. My tchila. What do you mean by tchila, Ravina? What categorizes the korban as tchila? Elema, perhaps you think that it means tchila Kohen Gadol. Tchila means that the avodah has to be done dafka by the Kohen Gadol. Is then Hainu Kamaisa. Then Ravina is simply repeating what we just had in the name of the previous answer of the Gemara, and that was Ravina himself. So Ravina, you're repeating what you told us before. Ella, but rather, what does he mean, Ravina, in the second answer by tchila? Avoda tchila b'makom. There is a first avoda in a certain place. Like, for example, in the case of Miluim, the preacher is meant to lead up to the first korban in the makom, meaning in the Mishkan, because the Mishkan was open for business for the first time on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. Yom Kippurim is also called Tchila b'makom because, as far as the year is concerned, if we take the unit of time of 365 days, there's only one occurrence in which the Kohen Gadol goes lifnai v'lifnim into the Kodesh Kodashim, and that's on Yom Kippur. And that's called an avoda tchila b'makom. It's the very first avoda for this annuum, for this year, in that makom, in the Kodesh Kodashim. And in that sense, there's a very profound similarity between Yom Kippurim and Miluim. In both cases, we are preparing for the first avoda in that makom, as opposed to all the other cases where we have many korbanos in that makom throughout the year. Now, earlier on Daf Beis, the Gemara quoted, actually the Mishnah quoted this halacha, Prisha of Kohen Gadol, Shivas Yom Kodem Yom Kippurim, and applied the same requirement to the Kohen Asoref Es Hapara, which is codified also in the Mishnah in the third parak of Masechet Para, that the Kohen Asoref Es Hapara has to be parish mibeso 7 days before the Sreifas Hapara. And we derive this halacha of Prisha with regard to the Kohen Gadol, the Kohen Asoref Es Hapara, from this very pasuk in the Parsha Miluim, where it says, "Kasher osa bayom hazeh tziva Hashem lasos lechaper aleichem," that just like in Miluim, they were poresh mibeisam into the Mishkan for 7 days, so too the Kohen Gadol is going to serve on Yom Kippurim is poresh mibeisam 7 days before his avoda, and the Kohen Asoref Sapara has to be poresh mibeisam for 7 days before Sreifa. And the Gemara now brings to machlokas regarding this structure. Ki asa Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bava, Amar, he said, Rabbi Yochanan masni chadam. Rabbi Yochanan, according to this version, has only one prisha derived from Milun, which presumably is going to be Yom Kippur. And Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, he had a different tradition in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Masni Tarte. So what are these two possibilities in terms of the drasha from Miluim? Rabbi Yochanan Masni Chada. Rabbi Yochanan only darshan the pasuk kasher also bayom hazeh tziva Hashem lasos lechaper aleichem elu maaseh Yom Kippurim. No mention whatsoever, no derivation of the prisha of the Kohen Asoref Sapara before the Sreifa of the Parah. However, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Masni Tarte, he's got two prishos that he derives from this pasuk in Miluim. Lasos elu ma'isa para This is the obligation of the Kohen Asor for Sapor to be parched with Beisel 7 days before the Sreif Sapor. And Lechaper, Elu Maise Yoma Kippurim, to teach us that the Kohen Gadol has an obligation to be parched with Beisel 7 days before Yoma Kippur. So the Gemara tries to clarify, what does this mean, Rabbi Yochanan Masni Chada? Our Mishnah, at the very beginning of this Masechet, establishes that there's a double Prisha. There's a Prisha of the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur for 7 days, and there's a parallel Prisha of the Kohen Asor Sapara, 7 days. So Rabbi Yochanan Masni Chadava Nan Tanan, our Mishnah establishes 2 Prishos, as it says, Shivas Yomim Kodem Yom Kippurim, and Shivas Yom Kodem Sreif Sapara. Then in both cases, we require Prisha of 7 days. So what does that mean? That Rabbi Yochanan, according to the version of Rav Dimi, only derived from the Pasuk Miluim 1 Prisha, when the Mishnah establishes 2 dinim of Prisha. And the Gemara answers, Maila Bialma. Rabbi Yochanan maintains that on a Doraisa level, the Torah only teaches us Prisha in the case of Kohen Gadol for Yom Kippur. The Prisha of the Kohen Asor v'Sapara is only a Drabanan. It's a Maila Bialma. It's a rabbinic institution. And it's all because of the Tzukim. When historically the movement of the Tzukim arose and they claimed that a Tful Yom whose tummy cannot be sorry for Sapara, and that's against our tradition as a Pruchim, so they established that we have to be Mitame, deliberately be Mitame, the Kohen Asor for Sapara as a Tful Yom, Lafuke, to make a public statement that we reject the halacha of the Tzukim, their ruling. And now that we were metame the Kohen Asor Sapara as a Tful Yom, we had to counterbalance that to make sure that they shouldn't be laid back about the Tahara requirements of Paraduma, and therefore they required Prisha 7 days. So that Chovas Prisha is not Doraisa, it's a Chumrah that the Rabbanu were Machmir in order lahotzi mi libon shalat stukim. So this is the tradition of Rav Dimi, his version of Rabbi Yochanan, that we don't derive from the pasuk of Miluim more than lechaper for Yom Kippur, but not for Kohen Asor Sapar. The Gemara right away asks for Omar Rab Min Yomi Bar Chilki Omar Rab Mechasya Bar Idi Omar Rab Yochanan. We have a tradition that the pasuk says Kasher Osa Bayom Hazeh Tziva Hashem Lasus Lechaper Alechu Lasus Elu Ma'aseh Parah Lechaper Elu Ma'aseh Yom Kippur. So we see clearly, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there is a tradition that Rabbi Yochanan derived both halachas and categories of prisha on a doraisa level. And the Gemara answers, that tradition in the name of Rabbi Yochanan is Hahu Dirabbe. If you take a look carefully at the Brisa, you will see that Rabbi Yochanan, when he quoted this halacha, that there's a Chiv Prisha of Kohen Asor Sapar derived from this pasuk, he was quoting it in the name of his Rebbe. But he himself never accepted it. The Chiasa Ravin. So until now we were Rav Dimi, came from Eretz Yisrael with the tradition of Rabbi Yochanan. Now it's Rav Dimi. Now it's Ravin who came from Eretz Yisrael. Amar Rabbi Yochanan Mishum Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yochanan was saying it in the name of Rabbi Yishmael that we have this double drasha. But Rabbi Yochanan himself doesn't agree. He believes, as we saw in the tradition of Rav Dimi in his name, that we don't darshan from this pasuk a chiv prisha for the Kohen Asor Sapara. We only derive one chiv prisha, namely the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippurim, and the entire entity of prisha, as it's formulated by the Mishnah, requiring prisha for the Kohen Asor Sapara. That's only the Rabbanan. That's a Maila Bial. Now, Abosai, we're at a major crossroads. And up until this point, we've assumed that the only act in town is that of Rabbi Yochanan. And the source for our Mishnah requiring Prishas Kohen Gadol 7 days before Yom Kippurim is the Parsha Milu. But Reish Lakish, as we're going to learn now, never accepted it. He has an entirely different source from which he derives the requirement of Prishas Kohen Gadol 7 days before Yom Kippur. Amalei Reish Lakish Rabbi Yochanan. Mehichaka Yalfis. You want to derive the chova, the obligation of Prishas Kohen Gadol 7 days before Yom Kippur from Miluim. I'm going to ask you the following question. How far are you going to go with this equation to Miluim? With regard to all the requirements and the mandates that were imposed upon Aaron and Bana for that 7-day period of Miluim leading up to Rosh Chodesh Nisan, those were all critical. They were likuva. And every single dimension of that mandate had to be fulfilled to the T in order for the din of Miluim to kick in and make the Kohanim valid and prepared for the Avodah. Is Afhochanami here too? Are you, Rabbi Yochanan, going to tell me that since Prishas Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur is derived from Miluim, therefore it's Likuva, which would mean that if the Kohen Gadol was not Poresh Mibeso for Sheves Yomim, then the entire Avodah, the whole enterprise of the service of Yom Kippurim is completely down the tubes, it's invalid, because Kol HaKosov Ben Ma'akiv for him, you have to use the same principle that you apply to Miluim of Kol HaKosov Ben Ma'akiv. Anything that's mentioned in the parsha is absolutely critical. And we have to apply that to Yom Kippurim, which is derived from Miluim, according to you, Rabbi Yochanan. Are you going to argue that in Chinami, just like in Miluim is Kol HaKosov Ben Ma'akiv, so too in Yom Kippurim Kol HaKosov Ben Ma'akiv? What's none? We have a Mishnah right here at the beginning of Masechet Yoma. They separate another Kohen, a second string Kohen, in an event that the first Kohen became Pasul, it became Tomei, became a Baal Eri. Then we immediately bring in from the bullpen the second replacement Korban. But it says Misakninan. We earmark and we designate the second string Kohen. But Lo Ktani, it doesn't say Mafrishin, that we take the second string Kohen Gadol and we take him and quarantine him from his house. There was no requirement to preach of 7 days, as we mentioned yesterday, with regard to the second string Kohen Gadol. It's only Misakninan, but not Mafrishinan. And how could the second string Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim step into the shoes of the first Kohen Gadol and do the avodah if he's missing preacher of 7 days before Yom Kippur? And according to you, Rabbi Yochanan, deriving Yom Kippur from Miluim is called Kasbe Ma'akim V'chitem, and if you'll count it. My Misakninan, what does the Mishnah mean by Misakninan? It means Mafreshinan. Maybe I shouldn't get so hung up, says Rabbi Reish Lakish, on this word Misakninan. And really what it means is Mafreshinan. So even the second string Kohen Gadol was quarantined from its house for 7 days before Yom Kippur. Says Rabbi Yochanan, says Reish Lakish, that's not a tenable position. Why? Listen, o idi misakninon, o idi mafreshinon. The Mishnah should have been consistent. Either use the word misakninon in both cases, both for the first Kohen and the second string Kohen Gadol, or use the word mafreshinon for not only the first Kohen Gadol, but also the second Kohen Gadol. From the fact that the Mishnah uses these two terms, that means that the Mishnah is trying to contrast between the first Kohen Gadol, the original Kohen Gadol, as opposed to the second string Kohen Gadol. That it says in the Reish of that Mishnah on Daf Beis and Aleph, with regard to the first Kohen Gadol, Mafreshinon, and with regard to the second Kohen Gadol, the Mishnah uses the word Misakninon. The inconsistency, the contrast in this terminology is indicative of the fact that there are two different dinim. With regard to the original Kohen Gadol, the first string Kohen Gadol, halacha is mafreshinon, he's obligated in prisha. With regard to the second Kohen Gadol, who in event that he has to fill in for the first, it's only misakninon and not mafreshinon. He was not porish mibeso for 7 days, and yet he's kosher, he can do the avodah, he qualifies as the Kohen Gadol. Now, we don't find that Rabbi Yochanan responded to this question of Reish Lakish, at least not at this stage in the sugya. So wait a minute. Rabbi Yochanan says to Reish Lakish, okay, you're being very destructive here. You're tearing down my whole thesis. Elamar, but you, my colleague, Mehecha Yolifle, where are you going to derive the requirement of Prisha, the Kohen Gadol, 7 days before Yom Kippur? You're not willing to derive from Miluim, because in Miluim it's called Kosbe Ma'akim Man, and in Yom Kippurim, clearly from that Mishnah, with regard to the second string Kohen Gadol, we've proven that it's not Ma'akim. So where do you derive it from? Amalei. And this next piece of Gemara is going to occupy us for a few blocks, for a couple of days. Reish Lakish says to Rabbi Yochanan Misinai, I'm going to derive the requirement of Kohen Gadol of Prisha from our Sinai. Because Moshe Rabbeinu was Poresh before he entered into what's called the Machne Shechina. Again, we'll talk a lot about Machne Shechina. And before he went up to receive the Torah on Har Sinai, he was Poresh before Kabbalas HaTorah at Har Sinai. Dichsiv, the pasuk says at the end of Parashas Mishpatim, Vayichkon Kvod Hashem al Har Sinai, Vayechaseu Anon Sheshes Yomim, Vayikra El Moshe B'Yom Hashvi Mitoch Anon. Now it says that the voice of God called out to Moshe from the glory, the cloud of glory, on the 7th day. It says, this is all Reish Lakish talking. Vayikra El Moshe B'Yom Hashvi Mitoch Anon. The voice cried out to Moshe Rabbeinu on the 7th day. It means clearly that the Anan was covering Moshe Rabbeinu for 6 days. Moshe Rabbeinu was enveloped by the cloud of glory for 6 days before he heard the voice of God coming out of the Anan on the 7th day. What does the pasuk mean when it says Vayichaseu Anan Sheshes Yomim? In other words, it could have said Vayichaseu Anan Vayikra El Moshe B'Yom Hashvi, but there's an extra emphasis here in the pasuk Vayichaseu Anan Sheshes Yomim. And why was it necessary? What was the Torah trying to teach us by adding this emphasis of Sheshes Yomim? Zebana Av, the Torah wants to tell you that it wasn't just a one-shot, one-time effort of Moshe Rabbeinu, that he was covered by the Anan for 6 days before he heard the voice of Hashem, but rather it's a generic rule that goes way beyond Moshe Rabbeinu and Har Sinai. Anyone who's entering into the Machne Shechina, which here is the Anan, Ton Prisha Shishas Yom, he's got to be Poresh Mibeso for 6 days before. Now, obviously, this is going to be problematic because our mission establishes Prisha of 7 days. And if Moshe Rabbeinu is the Binyan Av, if we're deriving Prisha from Moshe Rabbeinu, that was only 6 days. Okay, we'll get to that in Mir Hashem tomorrow. But in any event, the bottom line of Reish Lakish is that just like Moshe was Poresh 6 days in preparation for the Anan, for the voice of Hashem coming out of the cloud of glory, so too the Kohen Gadol, who's about to enter on Yom Kippurim into the Kodesh Kadoshim, which is a Machne Shechina. So we're comparing the Anan HaKavod of Har Sinai as a Machne Shechina to the Kodesh Kadoshim in the Beis HaMikdash as a Machne Shechina. He requires Prisha for 6 days before he goes into the Machne Shechina, meaning the Kodesh Kadoshim. So the Gemara immediately raises the following objection to Reish Lakish. V'anan Shiva Tanan. Our Mishnah requires Prisha of 7 days. Your Prisha, Reish Lakish, derived from Moshe Rabbeinu Har Sinai, was only 6 days. And the Gemara answers that you're right. As far as Chovas Prisha is concerned, it would be enough to be Parish Mibeso 6 days. But Masnisen, our Mishnah reflects the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseiri. The Chayish, and here we turn to Avdalad Omen Aleph, Litumas Beis. So the extra day is added because of what's called Tumas Beso, meaning 7 days is not miksha achas. It's made up of 2 parts, 6 plus 1. The 6 days are 6 days of Prisha before the Machne Shechina, before you go in to the Machne Shechina. That's derived from Moshe and Har Sinai. But now we're going to add a 7th day of Prisha for an entirely different reason. That 7th day is categorically different. It's Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira's Prisha mitumas beisa, which means the Gemara is going to go into this later on in the Vav, that we have to worry about the possibility that right before the 6 days of Prisha, if there were only 6 days, the Kohen Gadol had an intimate relationship with his wife, and perhaps she saw dam as a result of their intimacy. That would make the Kohen Gadol a boel nida, and a boel nida is tomei shivas yomim, 7 days. He would not be able to do the avodah on the 7th day because we're worried perhaps he was a boel nida and he's tomei and he cannot possibly do the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, we have to add 1 extra day to his prisha, and that's day number 7. But that's for a different reason entirely. Tumas Beiso, even though the prisha that we derive from Moshe Rabbeinu in terms of Har Sinai is only 6 days. So we have 6 days of Prisha, says Reish Lakish, before you go into the Machne Shechina. That's derived from Moshe, and we're going to equate the Kohen Gadol going into the Kodesh Kadoshim to Moshe going into the Anan. And the Machne Shechina, we require 6 days of Prisha. In the case of the Kohen Gadol, before Yom Kippurim, as a result of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira's dictum, we're going to have to add a 7th day because of Tumas Beis. Okay, so we're going to stop here on the top of Daf Daled Amud Aleph, Omalei Rabbi Yochanan L'Reish Lakish, and the continuing sugya is going to be an analysis of the machlokas between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish. Do we derive Prishas Kohen Gadol Shivas Yomim from Miluim, that's Rabbi Yochanan, or as Reish Lakish would have it, from Moshe Rabbeinu's being Koresh for 6 days at Har Sinai before the 7th day when he heard the Kol Hashem in the Machne Shechina. Take this opportunity to wish you all a great day.